we're going to move from person-to-person transmitted infections, respiratory, contact, sexual transmission, counter-transmission by vectors or by soil. Vectors can be anything from other mammals to a variety of biting arthropods. Fleas, ticks, lice, mosquitoes can all transmit a variety of agents. A variety of organisms that are transmitted by other animals. Those diseases are referred to as zoonotic diseases. Zoo referring to the animal source of the transmissible disease. Can be transmitted by direct contact, aerosols, or bites, and we'll talk about those. Virus that is transmitted through exposure to saliva of infected mammals can be wild or it can be domestic. In developed countries, the domestic reservoir is quite low, if non-existent, because of normal veterinary practices, immunization of dogs and cats to minimize the reservoir in that domestic population. Other parts of the world have higher incidences of rabies in those what we consider domestic. They may not be quite so domestic in other parts of the world. And then wild reservoirs. In the United States, skunks, coyotes, bats, raccoons are all potential reservoirs of naturally occurring rabies. Globally, large numbers of individuals, approaching 50,000 per year, die annually from rabies, predominantly in developing countries. Again, because in those developing countries, dogs and cats are the primary reservoir for the rabies virus. In developed countries, in North America, dogs and cats have a prevalence in fractions of a percent. Globally, prophylaxis, and we'll talk about what that is, it's treatment with rabies antisera, is administered to a large number of individuals to prevent the potential development of that disease. Widespread wild animals, potentially 50,000 or so, or 5,000 in the United States. Again, the reservoir can be any one of several different mammals. In the Pacific Northwest, it's typically bats. If you get bit by a radioactive bat, that's what might happen.
Radioactive?
Yeah. Maybe I'm mixing my superhero here.
They shut down Hanford, though.
Just want to see if we're still awake.
Yeah. The rabies virus then is transmitted by the saliva of these infected mammals. So it can either be a frank bite or it can be exposure to the saliva without a bite. One of the challenges with rabies is that because of the prolonged incubation period, which can be months, that there's not a good history of how the infection was acquired in a number of cases. Virus, don't worry about the specifics. The virus from the saliva then moves from the infected animal through the, either breaks in the skin or through a bite, and then from the lymphatics to the central nervous system and infects the brain and produces these unique staining lesions that are referred to as Negri bodies. So diagnosis is based on these lesions in the brain. As a result, Most diagnoses are post-mortem,
I was just gonna ask
either in
that.
animals or in humans. Untreated rabies, with rare exception, is fatal. Up until about 5 years ago, I didn't have to make that qualification because there were no documented surviving cases of rabies infections. Within the past 5 or 6 years, there's been 2 cases, probably due to better supportive intensive care therapy and unique host factors that allowed those couple individuals to survive. Talked about the prolonged incubation period, again, months before symptoms might develop. So that's what makes it hard epidemiologically to trace back to what the source was. The diagnosis using neurologic tissue, individuals that have a presumed exposure, either an animal bite, exposure to an animal in a living setting. One of the criteria for treatment now is not just an animal bite, but if there is, in our part of the country, if there is a bat within an enclosed living area, then those individuals, and I think there's some other criteria, the amount of time that there was a potential exposure, et cetera, that would be criteria for treatment with rabies immune globulin. How many of you remember our former governor, Gary Locke? Mm-hmm. Shortly after he was elected governor, he and his wife had a baby, and shortly after they took up residence with their newborn infant in the governor's mansion, there was a bat that was found in the living area, and all 3 of them, as well as their nannies and aides, all had rabies and a serum, rabies immune globulin, because of the potential exposure in that living area. May or may not have been overkill because of the high profile of the family, but that's neither here nor there. It was a situation that is typical of one of the more common types of exposures now, at least in our areas. Not a frank animal bite, but exposure to potentially to the animal, in the saliva of the animal. Rabies in the United States, less than 3 cases a year.
Nice cow.
I don't know specifically the survival of rabies in animal saliva. The rabies virus is an unenveloped virus, and those tend to survive longer. I would expect probably hours, not for days and weeks. Another agent that is transmitted by animals is the prion that can cause neurologic infection in not just cows but also sheep. Prions are infectious proteins that, through consumption of contaminated neurologic tissue from that animal, can transmit that prion to humans, causing them dementia and ultimately death in acquisition of that protein or prion. Infectious proteins highly resistant ultraviolet light, ionizing radiation, chemical, high temperatures, etc., that normally kill living biological agents. So it's hard to inactivate these prions. The prion that is associated with the mad cow syndrome actually originated in sheep. There is a naturally occurring prion disease in sheep called scrappy. There are agricultural practices that prevent the use of animal tissue containing neurologic tissue as feed for other animals. What happened in the case of mad cow disease, where there were cases of both bovine and then human prion disease, was that in Europe there was a break in that practice, and there was some inappropriate cattle feed that contained not just tissue, but neurologic tissue from sheep that contained the prion, that transmitted that to cattle. The cattle acquired the prion. A number of cattle developed behavioral abnormalities associated with the neurologic effect of the prion in the brain. Some cattle, pre-symptoms, made their way into the human food chain. And there were then a cluster of cases of human dementia that was traced back to contaminated cattle consumption, and then in an epidemiologic investigation it was found that those cattle came from common feedlots that consumed common cattle feed from sheep that ultimately was traced back to find that it was not properly produced such that it was free of any neurologic material from the sheep. There are occasionally naturally occurring cases of prion disease from other animals. There have been cases of human-acquired prion disease, presumably from wild populations of elk. There were several cases in, it was either Wisconsin or Minnesota, doesn't matter, that were traced back to a group of hunters that had consumed some of the elk meat that they had from their hunting. Another virus, the hantavirus, we talked about that in one of our, saw the kind of the history, at least in in the Americas, about the hantavirus and its discovery in the Four Corners area of the United States in the early 1990s. Got its name from the region in Korea where it was first identified. We had not seen a hantavirus in the Americas in the Western Hemisphere prior to this time. And the Four Corners outbreak was the first time there had been documented cases of human disease. I say documented. There had been cases of human disease, but they had been so sporadic that they'd never been identified. And that's what the video alluded to, that in other parts of the world, that's the point of talking about the